hearing from business leaders here, yikes, if these tariffs are as big as what they say, it's going to have a very material impact on conditions, and expressions of, we don't want to go back to 2021 and 2022 when costs were raging out of control. And we definitely don't want to go back to 2020 when the supply chain was so disrupted we literally could not make our product. We couldn't get chips. We couldn't do others. So extra sensitivity to tariff policy. The second thing that I always say, it's the 7th district. Chicago's the 7th district. 7th district, because it's got this manufacturing, tends to be among the most cyclically sensitive of all the districts. Like with Michigan, when times are going well for the nation, stuff goes very well for Michigan, and it's also a leading indicator of recession, usually. That if the economy starts turning down, where you see it right away are in these cyclically sensitive industries. So national policy, if you think national policy is going to lead to a slowdown or recession, a lot of times they'd be looking at Michigan, or they'd be looking in places like that for evidence of it.
So tariffs.
Yeah.
Tariffs are kind of the number one issue that business leaders are talking about. It's probably the number one chatter point in the participants of this conference. We just had some news. Just last night, the Court of International Trade ruled that the President of the United States does not have the authority to implement the tariffs that he has been talking about and implementing. There are members of Congress who are saying, hey, we need to take back our authority on tariffs because it's generally considered to be a congressional purview.
Yeah, it's written right in the Constitution.
That would be a strong indication of that. But my point is, all this is leading to such a level of uncertainty. Going back to the dual mandate, how does the Federal Reserve Bank navigate such uncertainty? How do you deal with, kind of an unprecedented tariff approach?
I like how you said going back to the dual mandate, because that's usually my answer. How do you deal with whatever? By going back to the dual mandate. If it affects prices or it affects employment, then we have to think about it. Not just backward looking, but also what will this do to the economic outlook? But that's just a condition, okay? Yes, this tariff bit, this would be if they put in 10% tariffs, that'd be the highest in 90-something years. If they had put in the 25% version, it'd be the highest in 130 years. But conditions change all the time. I always say that our motto at the Fed is the same as the Midwest, that there's no bad weather, only bad clothing. You tell me what the conditions are, and I'll tell you what jacket you're supposed to wear. And tariffs are conditions. They're like, hey, if it's going to rain today, fine, we'll put on a rain jacket. It's not the place of the Fed to express A, B, or C as a good fiscal policy or bad fiscal policy, I think. To me, you become a sworn member of the Fed, you're out of the fiscal policy business. That said, it's a lot easier to deal with the conditions when there isn't the uncertainty that we've been going through. We had a big Fed Listens event at the Chicago Fed 2 weeks ago, maybe, and people came in from all over the district and talked about conditions, and the phrase used by there was a construction company head that was there and said, this is for us a pencils down moment in the economy, that we can't keep taking the test. We're putting our pencils down and we're just going to wait to figure out what's going to be, and we need some consistency. Now, if on the back end of this thing, either we don't put the tariffs in or they reach some deals that allow us to avoid doing that. We could go back to what we were prior to April 2nd, which I characterized as basically unemployment rate pretty close to 4%, stable full employment, inflation trending down to, looked to me like on path to the 2% inflation target that the Fed has outlined. And if you have stable full employment and inflation going to target, rates can come down to where they would eventually settle, which most of the dot plot, where they ask all the members of the committee periodically, where do you see rates, the appropriate level for rates a year from now, 2 years from now, and in the long run. The long run rates where people think it will settle are well below where they are today. So if we can get the dust out of the air, I do still think that underneath there is a strong dual mandate economy. The longer we go contemplating really big changes, like some of the ones that have been discussed, the more that fades into the background. And it's kind of like I told Sandy this story of some years ago. I went to the gym and I said, I'm going to get in shape, and I hired a trainer. And the trainer, she asked me, what are your long-term goals? I was like, if I lift enough, weights, do you think I could get a six-pack? And the trainer said, well, everyone's has a six-pack underneath. She said, the problem is not the lifting of weights. It's you've got to get all of what's on top of there off before you can see it. And I feel a bit like that on the economy. If we could just get this off of there, there's a six-pack underneath.
Yeah. I love that you're waiting for the dust to settle, because you must be a very patient man if you are waiting for the dust to settle in today's political environment. So I'm going to play devil's advocate.
Oh, boy.
So the president has been agitating for lower interest rates, and I'm going to hearken back to my time on the board before we hired you, your predecessor, Charlie Evans, an amazing economist and leader. And those of us who were on the board at that time, kind of during those days coming out of COVID, supply chains were going crazy, prices were going crazy, and the Federal Reserve System, kind of as a whole, kept using the word, this is going to be transient, which I'm sure is a word that's been now banned.
Yeah, banned. Yeah.
But, that was the vibe, if you will. I mean, those of us who were on the board and others across the country were saying, hey, these prices are going up and we don't anticipate them going down. They're really impacting us. But the data, that you guys were listening to said, no, I'm going to suggest that perhaps, it may have been a slight misreading. Is there any chance that President Trump is right and that we should be looking at lowering interest rates?
I would split this question into two. There are two distinct ideas in that. One is about what's happening with inflation. There's no question, looking back, it didn't end up being transitory of the less than 1 year variety.
Yeah, we noticed.
And they were wrong. They were. I wasn't there. I didn't.
No, you weren't there.
But I wasn't there.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm throwing Charlie under the bus.
There's still argument within the Fed and within the economics community about what was the nature of that miss. Was it because demand? The argument was this is a supply disruption, and supply disruption will be fixed, and when it fixes, it should go away. So this should be a temporary increase in inflation, which goes away for inflation. It might be a one-time increase in prices, but that's not a one-time forever increase in the rate of growth of inflation. Now they've kind of been characterized, Steve Leisman described it, it turns out they were right inflation turned out to be transitory. Okay, so the supply chain begins to heal, but not in 2021, in 2023. Okay, so inflation falls close to as much as it's ever fell in 1 year without a recession in 2023, which is very unusual, but that took a couple of years.
But it also
That's
took
separate from if the president is expressing an opinion that he wants rates lowered, it hasn't been expressed in the dual mandate. That was an argument about the dual mandate. Mm-hmm. This it feels a little more just like an expression of desire on rates. The Secretary of the Treasury said that the president's statement wasn't really about Fed policy because the Fed sets the Fed's funds rate, which is a short-term interest rate. Long-term rates, like 30-year treasuries, that's determined by the market. And Secretary Bessent said that what the president wants is to lower long-term interest rates, which the Fed does not control. And so I didn't disagree with that. You know, the president, if that's what the president wants, to us that's just a condition, and so I didn't have an opinion about it.
And Donald Trump's not the first president to try to influence the Fed to lower interest rates. You know, Johnson famously, Nixon famously. So this is something that, you know, the leaders of the Fed like you are used to.
Yes, it still makes me, I still think we want to not lose sight of what is the advantage to just everyday people of the central bank being independent of political interference. If politics gets to control the interest rate, inflation is coming back. I mean, as I say, this core tenet of why economists are close to unanimous on the importance of central bank independence is sometimes the central bank has got to do things that the political apparatus is not going to enjoy because in the short run they involve some tough decisions.
So switching gears a little bit, your mentor is the famous Fed president, Paul Volcker.
Indeed. And
Volcker, you know, ran the Fed probably during one of the most difficult economic times where we had this thing called stagflation. Now, economists, particularly I'm going to call them left-leaning economists, are ringing the alarm bell that stagflation may be in our future. Can you talk about the lessons learned during the Volcker years and what you learned from your mentor, Chairman Volcker?
Paul Volcker was a giant. He was physically a giant. He's 6'7" and a very large man, but he's also figuratively a giant. And the all-time great central bank head. They raised the Fed funds rate to 20% when he was the Fed chair because inflation was out of control, 13% plus inflation. And he recognized the Fed's got to do something very hard here. The expectations are unanchored, so when people are coming down to negotiate contracts, they're presuming that inflation is going to be 10% plus, so they're demanding wages of more than 10% increases because they think inflation is going to be higher. And once you get on that wage price spiral, it's very, very difficult to get off of it. They raised them to interest rates to 20% and held them there. And he basically said, I will hold, no matter how much this hurts, I will hold this here until we get inflation back under control. And they did it, but not without a lot of complaint by both political figures and just ordinary Americans. And see, Volcker's widow gave me, when he died, the original 2x4 that they had mailed to Volcker and written on it, just scrawled on the front, it says, "Please lower these insane interest rates." And he can, and I keep that on the shelf right next to my desk to remind me of Volcker. But what the Fed decides affects regular people. It's not just a game to be played out in the stock market or something like that. It affects construction. It affects purchasing cars. It affects whether you can buy a house, business investment. And number two, the Fed has to take tough action. They have to do the hard thing sometimes. And he did that. If you apply that lesson to today, I kind of think it goes back to this Fed independence. Nobody was more independent than Volcker, and I do think that's an important lesson that we not lose sight of.
And I bring up the Volcker years, not just because I know he's your mentor, but also it is essentially a version of the same strategy that you used when you became Fed president and your peers during that high inflation period where you did increase interest rates pretty substantially, basically from no interest rates to 5 or 6%.
Yes, I showed up in January of 2023, and I said in one of my first speeches, I was like, I've been there for 6 weeks. I've already voted to raise rates 2 times. Took my predecessor 8 years to do that. And it is true that once it became clear that inflation was not going to be transitory the way that the Fed and the private markets thought it was going to be when it began, then they began raising interest rates. It is a little bit different of a circumstance, I feel, than the Volcker years in that this was mostly a supply shock, in my view. And stagflation is the toughest scenario to face a central bank because there's not an automatic playbook. If it's excess demand, excess overheating, you raise rates and that's how you cool it off. If the reason prices are going up is not from just overheating of the economy, but is because the costs of production are rising or the cost of oil is rising, that's a lot more difficult circumstance.
No tools there.
You got to weigh off. Now it puts the two sides of the dual mandate kind of in conflict, which sometimes they aren't in conflict. But if Back to the Future style, you could call up people in the 1970s and you said, "Oh, hey, pass, we're dealing with stagflation. How can you help us?" The first thing they'd say is, "Well, what's your unemployment rate?" And you'd be like, "Well, it's about 4. 4? What's your inflation rate?" "Well, it's 2.5. They'd be like, "What are you bothering us?" In the 1970s, stagflation was 13% inflation with unemployment that was almost 8. So the stagflation is the direction, but it's not stagflation. I mean, this is not 1970 style stagflation. It is stagflationary direction, meaning prices are going up at the same time. Inflation is rising at the same time employment is deteriorating. That's a stagflationary impulse.
I want to switch gears. Housing.
Yeah.
How important is housing? The cost of housing, the availability of housing, what it means to the labor market. How does that factor into the Fed's work?
How important is it to society? Very important. To consumers? Very important. To the dual mandate? Moderate importance. Housing tends to be a pretty cyclical and interest rate sensitive sector. And in this weird period, this was the weirdest, COVID was by far the weirdest recession we've ever had. It looked nothing like any previous recession. And the coming out of COVID, therefore, is among the weirdest recoveries we've ever had. And the persistence of inflation was heavily rooted in the persistence of housing inflation. And that led us to a whole hand-wringing effort among economic analysts to figure out why housing inflation has been as persistent as it is. And we still don't fully know, but it started to come down. The only thing that I want to emphasize is if you look at the relative price of housing, okay, so housing versus going to Target or Costco or Walmart, the price of goods versus the price of housing, it has been an extreme case the last couple of years that housing inflation's remained very high and goods inflation returned to the norm of the last 15, 20 years of mild deflation in goods, sort of, let's call it 4 or 5% per year housing inflation, goods minus 1% a year. It's important to note, we spent, that's not a new phenomenon. If you look over the last 15 years, housing's been growing 4% a year while goods minus 1% a year. Look, you don't have to be the Mackinac Policy Conference to know that if something compounds 5% a year for 15 or 20 years, the level is going to be very different. So when you hear young people today say, my dad had one job and he used to be able to afford a big house and whatever, and I can't even afford a condo. They're not wrong. They're not wrong. The relative, now, they can buy a lot more stuff at Costco than their dad used to do, but the relative price of housing has changed quite a lot and gotten much more expensive. And the mortgage market has gotten more 30-year fixed rate mortgage centric. That now dominates the market, and that's made housing a little less sensitive to monetary policy shifts. So one of the ways monetary policy affects the real economy is, hey, if the interest rate goes up, mortgages get more expensive. But if everybody's locked in their rates, you kind of saw that play out. People were locked in at these low rates, and so even as rates were going up, they just kind of stopped moving if they could help it because they didn't want to give up a cheap mortgage in that environment.
So this is going to be the last question.
Okay.
You have been on the Council of Economic Advisors, chair actually. You've been a university professor, endowed chair professor in economics. You're obviously president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago.
Here it comes.
Right now.
You could feel it, right?
No,
Here it comes. What is it? What?
This is not the
Okay.
Dr. Chuckle Hut thing.
Okay.
What keeps you up at night?
What keeps me up at night? I say flippantly, not to be Dr. Chucklehead, but I always say, look, the central bank's job is not to sleep at night. We're like the night's watch, this. But the always and everywhere, remember, the Fed was created in 1913 out of the panic of 1907. So financial panic and financial crisis, there was always a possibility. And that the issues of financial stability should always keep us up at night. I still think that the strong dual mandate gives me some comfort, but the more the tariffs can jump out of their lane, at the end of the day, imported goods are only 11% of GDP in the United States. We're overwhelmingly a domestically driven economy with heavily services. And so there's a bit of a puzzle. Why do people get as nervous about discussion of tariffs as they do if it's only 11% of the economy? And I think it's because there are three clear ways that it can jump out of its lane and affect more. One is if there's retaliation from other countries, now you just doubled the size of the tariffs affect the imports, but now it's going to affect the exports. 2, the tariffs can be parts, supplies, components into other things. So now the tariffs just jumped into domestic manufacturing. And then category 3 is if people freak out about anything and change their behavior, either their consumer spending or business investment or uncertainty or any of those, now it can have a far more outsized impact than just what it mechanically looks like it would have. That freak out channel is the kind of thing that should keep us up at night, thinking about how those play out.
Well, for our audience, both online and in the audience right here in the room, highly recommend Googling Austan Goolsbee, DC Improv. Only comedian I know who showed up at the Improv wearing his White House credentials.
It was a contest, DC's Funniest Celebrity Contest, and it's true I was the winner.
Yeah.
But it's always the central question of economics is compared to what, and the runner-up was Grover Norquist.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't know. So, but also do the Daily Show. Austan, you have been such a tremendous leader in the public in public service. Such a leader in the economics. It was such an honor for me, and I see some of your other board members here in the audience today to serve on the board under your leadership.
You were an amazing Hall of
much.
Fame board chair and board member, and this is a Hall of Fame conference too. So congratulations to you on this. Another big